The red laser dots danced across my chest like deadly fireflies as I stood frozen on my own front porch, hands raised above my head, watching 23 heavily armed SWAT officers surround my property. Behind their riot shields and tactical gear, I could see the smug satisfaction on Brenda Hartwell's face as she pointed her manicured finger directly at me from behind the police line. "That's him!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the desert air like a rusty blade. "That's the domestic terrorist who's been threatening our entire community." The SWAT commander's voice boomed through his megaphone. "GETONTHAGAR, UNDNOW? HANDSBEHINDYOURHEAD. That's when I saw him. Behind the wall of tactical officers, removing his helmet with a look of absolute confusion, was my cousin Jake Martinez, Captain Jake Martinez of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Our eyes met across the chaos, and I watched his expression transform from professional alertness to pure volcanic rage. What Brenda Hartwell didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her pathetic, power-hungry life. Moving to Desert Oaks seemed like a dream come true. After years of cramped city apartments and suffocating office jobs, I'd finally saved enough to buy my grandfather's old ranch house, 12 acres of pure freedom in the California desert, complete with a renovated barn, horse stables, and enough space to breathe without neighbors breathing down my neck. Or so I thought. The first sign of trouble came on day 3, when I was unloading my truck in the driveway. A white Lexus UV pulled up with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been assembled from spare Karen parts, bleached blonde bob, designer athleisure wear that had never seen actual athletics, and the kind of entitled posture that screamed, "I demand to speak to your manager," from 50 yards away. "Excuse me?" she called out, not bothering with introductions. "I'm Brenda Hartwell, president of the Desert Oaks Community Association. We need to discuss your property compliance issues." I set down the box I was carrying, my grandmother's china, ironically enough, and walked over with what I thought was a friendly smile. "Hi there. I'm Marcus. Just moved in yesterday." "What compliance issues?" She pulled out a tablet and began scrolling with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly done this dance before. "Well, for starters, that fence." She gestured toward the original wooden rail fence that had bordered the property since the 1968. "It's not regulation height, and the materials don't meet our community aesthetic standards." "Community standards? This is a working ranch." Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Not anymore, sweetie. Desert Oaks incorporated as a planned community 3 years ago. Your property is now subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." She handed me a thick binder with the satisfaction of someone delivering a death sentence. "You'll find everything you need to know in there." I flipped through the binder, my heart sinking with each page. No structures over 6 feet tall. No vehicles parked in driveways for more than 24 hours. No agricultural activities that might create noise or odors. No outdoor storage of equipment. The list went on for 67 pages, each restriction more ridiculous than the last. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. I bought this property specifically because it was zoned agricultural. I have horses coming next month." "Had horses," she corrected. "The community voted to rezone this area for residential use only. Livestock are no longer permitted. You can't just change zoning without notifying property owners." "Actually, we can." And we did. Property owners were notified by certified mail 6 months ago. Her smile was pure venom. "Perhaps your grandfather didn't forward the notice before he passed?" Grandpa Joe had died 8 months ago, and I'd been dealing with probate ever since. If they'd sent notices to his old address, I never would have seen them. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice level, I understand you have community standards, but this property has been in my family for 3 generations. The horses, the barn, the fencing, it's all part of the ranch's heritage. Heritage doesn't trump property values, Marcus. Our residents invested in a high-end community, not a barnyard. She closed her tablet with a decisive snap. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance. After that, we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies. She climbed back into her Lexus and drove away, leaving me standing in my driveway holding a binder full of regulations designed to destroy everything my grandfather had built. But Brenda Hartwell had no idea who she was messing with. The first citation arrived exactly 1 week later. Unauthorized agricultural structures with a grainy photo of my grandfather's barn attached. Fine, $500. I called the number on the citation and reached a bored-sounding woman named Cheryl at the Community Association office. Ma'am, this barn has been here since 1963. How can it suddenly be unauthorized? Sir, all existing structures needed to be registered for grandfathering status within 90 days of the zoning change. That deadline passed 6 months ago. I didn't even own the property 6 months ago. That's not our problem, sir. You can file an appeal, but you'll need to pay the citation first. $500 to appeal a fine for a barn that predated their entire community by 40 years. I paid it, knowing I had no choice. The second citation came 3 days later. Excessive vehicle storage, featuring a photo of my pickup truck parked in front of my own house. Another $500. The third citation was for non-compliant fencing materials. The fourth was for unapproved landscaping apparently. My grandfather's vegetable garden violated their native plant requirements. By the end of the month, I'd received 11 citations totaling $6,500 in fines, each one more absurd than the last. They cited my mailbox for being rustic style in a modern community. They cited my gravel driveway for inappropriate surface materials. They even cited the American flag on my front porch for being oversized according to display regulations. I tried calling Brenda directly. This is harassment, I said, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. This is community standards enforcement, she replied coolly. Marcus, you moved into an upscale neighborhood. Either adapt to our lifestyle or find somewhere more suitable to your needs. This was my grandfather's ranch. My family has owned this land longer than your community has existed. And now it's time for change. Progress, Marcus. Some people embrace it, others get left behind. The condescension in her voice made my blood boil. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find county workers installing a CONDEMNEDP-ROPEIAETY sign at the end of my driveway. My hands were shaking as I called the planning department. Sir, we received a complaint about unsafe structures and potential health code violations, the clerk explained. An inspector will be out tomorrow to assess the situation. What kind of violations? Let me see. Unauthorized livestock facilities, improper waste management, potential groundwater contamination from agricultural runoff. Every single allegation was false. I didn't even have livestock yet. My horses weren't arriving for another week. But that didn't matter to Inspector Ray Davidson, who showed up the next morning with a clipboard and an attitude that suggested he'd already made up his mind. Mr. Rodriguez, I'm going to need to see permits for all structures on this property. It's Marcus Rodriguez Johnson, actually. And what permits? These buildings are older than I am. Doesn't matter. County requires retroactive permitting for any structure over 200 square feet if there's been a change in property use or ownership. He walked through my property like he was investigating a crime scene, taking photos of everything from the barn to the chicken coop to the old well house. Every structure that my grandfather had built with his own hands over 40 years of hard work. "I'm going to have to red tag the barn," he said finally. "Electrical doesn't meet current code, and there's no proper foundation documentation." "Inspector Davidson, that barn has been here since 1963. It passed every county inspection when my grandfather built it. 1,963 standards aren't 2023 standards. You want to keep the barn, you need to bring it up to current code. Probably looking at $40,000 in upgrades." $40,000. I didn't have to upgrade a perfectly functional barn that had weathered 6 decades of desert storms without a single problem. And what if I can't afford the upgrades? His smile was apologetic, but his eyes were cold. "Then the county will be forced to condemn the structure and order demolition. For safety reasons, you understand." As I watched him drive away, I realized this wasn't just about HOA compliance anymore. Brenda Hartwell had weaponized the county government against me, using bureaucratic red tape to destroy what she couldn't control through community association rules. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I was just another victim who would roll over and accept defeat. She was about to learn otherwise. That evening, I called the only person I knew who might understand the legal maze. I was trapped in my cousin Jake Martinez. We'd grown up together, 2 kids from working-class families who'd taken different paths, but maintained the bond forged during childhood summers at Grandpa Joe's ranch. Jake had gone into law enforcement straight out of high school, working his way up from patrol officer to detective to his current position as captain of special operations for Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I'd gone to college, bounced between corporate jobs, and finally decided to return to the family land. "Marcus, what the hell is going on out there?" Jake's voice was tight with concern. "I got word through channels that there's some kind of dispute involving your property." I explained the situation, the HOA harassment, the bogus citations, the county inspector's threats. Jake listened without interrupting, but I could hear his breathing getting heavier as I described each escalation. "Cousin, you're dealing with some serious corruption here. This Brenda woman is using her connections to weaponize government agencies against a private citizen. That's a federal civil rights violation. Jake, I don't want to get you involved in family drama." "Family drama?" His laugh was harsh. "Marcus, they're trying to steal Grandpa Joe's ranch. The same ranch where we learned to ride horses, where Abuela taught us to shoot, where Tio Roberto showed us how to fix engines with nothing but wire and determination. This isn't drama, it's war." Jake's voice dropped to the tone he probably used when briefing his tactical teams. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to document every interaction with the HOA and county officials. Photos, recordings, written communications, everything. I'm going to make some calls and see what kind of connections this Brenda person has." "What kind of calls?" "The kind that reveal whether certain county inspectors are getting kickbacks to red tag properties in specific neighborhoods. The kind that show whether HOA board members have financial interests in development companies that benefit from forcing out longtime residents." 2 days later, Jake called back with information that changed everything. "Marcus, your HOA president is married to Robert Hartwell, senior partner at Hartwell Development Group. They're the company that's been buying up agricultural properties in your area for conversion to luxury housing. Every property they force into compliance violations becomes available for acquisition at below market prices. So this whole harassment campaign is a real estate scam. They manufacture violations to force property owners to sell cheap, then flip the land for massive profits. And Marcus? They've done it 17 times in the last 3 years." My hands were clenched into fists. "Is it legal?" "Technically, yes. Morally and ethically? They're parasites, feeding on working-class families who can't afford to fight back. Jake's voice carried the cold fury of a man who dedicated his career to protecting people from exactly this kind of predator. But Marcus, they picked the wrong family to mess with this time. Over the next week, Jake and I developed what he called Operation Grandfather's Revenge. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Give Brenda Hartwell exactly what she was asking for, but with consequences she couldn't imagine. You said she wants you to throw a proper community event to show you're committed to neighborhood integration, right? Jake asked during one of our planning sessions. Yeah, some kind of meet your neighbor's barbecue. Claims it would demonstrate good faith toward community relations. Perfect. We're going to give her the biggest, most spectacular community barbecue this desert has ever seen. A real celebration of our family's ranching heritage. I could hear the smile in his voice. Jake, what are you planning? Marcus, how many law enforcement officers do you think grew up coming to Grandpa Joe's ranch for family reunions? I started counting. Jake's brothers in the Highway Patrol, our cousins in Border Patrol, family friends in a TFDE AFBI, Uncle Roberto's kids who joined the military and now worked federal security. At least 30, maybe 40. And how many of them do you think would love to attend a good old-fashioned ranch barbecue to honor Grandpa Joe's memory? All of them. And how many of them do you think drive official vehicles that they're authorized to take home? I started laughing. Jake, you magnificent bastard. She wants to see what kind of neighbors you attract? Let's show her exactly what the Rodriguez-Johnson family brings to the community. The plan crystallized over the following days. We'd send formal invitations to every family member in law enforcement, military, and emergency services. We'd make it a memorial celebration for Grandpa Joe, complete with traditional foods, mariachi music, and all the cultural activities that Brenda Hartwell had been complaining about. Most importantly, we'd do it completely within the law. Every permit pulled, every regulation followed, every I dotted and T crossed. She wouldn't be able to cite us for a single violation. But there was one more element Jake insisted on. Marcus, I want you to invite the entire HOA board and all your neighbors. Make it a genuine community outreach event. Kill them with kindness. Are you insane? They'll just use it as ammunition against me. Trust me, cousin. Sometimes the best way to expose a snake is to put it in a room full of eagles. The formal invitation I sent to every Desert Oaks resident was a masterpiece of aggressive politeness. Dear neighbors, you are cordially invited to a memorial barbecue celebrating the life and legacy of Joe Rodriguez, longtime Desert Oaks resident and patriarch of our family ranch. This community event will showcase the rich cultural heritage and family traditions that have been part of this land for over 60 years. Join us for traditional Mexican cuisine, live mariachi music, and the opportunity to meet the extended Rodriguez-Johnson family, including many members who serve our community in law enforcement, military, and emergency services. Date: Saturday, June 15th, 0 p.m. 8:00 p.m. Location: 47,235 Desert Rose Road, the Rodriguez-Johnson Family Ranch. Attire: casual/Western. We look forward to sharing our family story and building stronger community connections. Respectfully, Marcus Rodriguez-Johnson. I hand-delivered copies to every house in the development, watching faces range from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Brenda Hartwell answered her door in a silk bathrobe at 2 p.m., looking like she'd just rolled out of bed. "What is this?" she demanded, scanning the invitation. "Community outreach, just like you suggested. I thought it would be good for everyone to meet my family and understand our connection to this land." Her eyes narrowed as she reread the part about law enforcement family members. "How many people are we talking about?" "Oh, not too many. Maybe 60 or 70 close family and friends. 60 or 70? Her voice pitched higher. Marcus, this is a quiet residential community, not some kind of festival ground. Don't worry, Brenda. We've pulled all the necessary permits, hired professional security, and coordinated with the county for parking and traffic management. Everything completely by the book. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out how to object to a permitted legal community event that she'd specifically requested. Well, she said finally, I suppose if it's properly managed. Oh, it will be. My cousin Jake is handling security coordination. He's very experienced with large-scale event management. What I didn't mention was that Jake's event management experience involved coordinating multi-agency law enforcement operations and tactical responses, or that his security coordination meant ensuring we had more badges per square foot than a police convention. I'll see you Saturday, Brenda. Can't wait for you to meet the family. Her smile was strained enough to crack. Looking forward to it. As I walked away, I could feel her watching me from her doorway, probably trying to figure out how her simple harassment campaign had evolved into hosting a law enforcement barbecue in her backyard neighborhood. Saturday morning dawned clear and hot, typical desert weather that would have been perfect for the kind of ranch barbecue Grandpa Joe used to throw. By 10 a.m., I was setting up tables and checking the permit documentation one final time when the first vehicle started arriving. Jake rolled up in his official sheriff's department, SUV wearing civilian clothes, but with his badge and service weapon clearly visible. Behind him came a convoy that looked like a law enforcement parade, highway patrol cruisers, border patrol units, DEA sedans, ATF trucks, and military vehicles driven by active duty and veteran family members. Marcus, Jake called out, embracing me with the kind of bear hug that had been standard at Rodriguez family gatherings since we were kids. Ready to show these people what real community looks like. Born ready, Captain. By noon, my property looked like the staging area for a federal task force operation. Official vehicles filled every available parking space, their radio chatter creating a constant low buzz of professional communication. Officers in civilian clothes mingled with family members, everyone clearly relaxed and enjoying themselves. But the visual impact was unmistakable. This wasn't just a family barbecue. This was a demonstration of exactly who the Rodriguez Johnson family was connected to. The mariachi band arrived at 1:30, followed by the catering truck loaded with enough authentic Mexican food to feed a small army. By 2 p.m., the party was in full swing, with the sound of laughter, music, and conversation carrying across the desert air. That's when I saw Brenda Hartwell's white Lexus creeping down my driveway like she was approaching a crime scene. She parked at the edge of the gathering and sat in her car for nearly 10 minutes, clearly trying to process what she was seeing. Finally, she emerged wearing a forced smile and a sundress that screamed, "I'm trying to fit in with the common people." "Marcus," she called out with artificial enthusiasm. "What a impressive turnout. Brenda, so glad you could make it. Come meet the family." I guided her toward the main group, where Jake was holding court with a cluster of relatives, telling stories about Grandpa Joe's legendary hospitality. As we approached, Jake looked up with the kind of smile that made criminals confess and politicians squirm. "You must be Mrs. Hartwell," he said, extending his hand. "Captain Jake Martinez, Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I've heard so much about your work with the Community Association." Brenda's handshake was limp, her eyes darting around the gathering as she tried to count badges and assess the situation. "Captain Martinez. How? Nice to meet you." "Jake's my cousin," I explained casually. "He grew up spending summers here at the ranch with Grandpa Joe. In fact, most of the family has law enforcement or military backgrounds. It's kind of a tradition." "How interesting," Brenda managed, her voice strained. Jake's smile never wavered. "Mrs. Hartwell, Marcus tells me you've been very attentive to community standards lately. I appreciate residents who take an active interest in neighborhood safety and property maintenance." "Well, someone has to ensure standards are maintained." "Absolutely. In my line of work, I've learned that the best communities are built on mutual respect and understanding between neighbors." "Don't you agree?" Brenda nodded mechanically, but I could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the party being held under shade canopies. She was beginning to understand that her campaign of harassment had just collided with a family full of people who understood exactly how harassment worked and how to stop it. But the best was yet to come. Around 4 p.m., just as the party was hitting its peak energy, I noticed Brenda huddled near her car, talking rapidly on her phone. Her body language screamed panic, rapid hand gestures, furtive glances toward the party, the kind of agitated pacing that suggested she was making the kind of call people make when they think they're in immediate danger. Jake noticed it too. "Marcus, your HOA president looks a little stressed. Think we should check on her? Let's see what develops." What developed exceeded our wildest expectations. 20 minutes later, the distinctive sound of multiple sirens began echoing across the desert. Not the casual single-unit response to a noise complaint, but the kind of multi-vehicle, high-priority response that suggested someone had reported an active threat. Jake's radio crackled to life. "All units, respond to 47,235 Desert Rose Road for reported domestic terrorism gathering. Multiple suspects, possible weapons, request SWAT support." The entire party went quiet as law enforcement family members began checking their own radios and phones. Jake's expression transformed from amused to professionally alert in seconds. "Marcus, what the hell did that woman tell them?" Before I could answer, the first Sheriff's Department units came racing up my driveway, followed by Highway Patrol, Border Patrol, and finally the SWAT vehicle that had been called out for what dispatch described as a potential domestic terrorism cell operating undercover of a community gathering. The tactical team deployed with military precision, taking positions around my property as if they were preparing to assault a compound. Neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the sirens and the spectacle of what looked like a federal raid in progress. That's when the SWAT commander began barking orders through his megaphone, demanding I get on the ground with my hands behind my head, treating me like a dangerous criminal on my own property at my own family barbecue. And that's when Jake Martinez, captain of special operations, removed his helmet and revealed himself to his own tactical team. The confusion was immediate and absolute. SWAT officers began looking back and forth between their commander and Jake, trying to understand how their captain had somehow ended up inside the perimeter of what they'd been told was a terrorist gathering. "Stand down." Jake's voice carried the kind of authority that made armed officers instantly obey. "All units stand down immediately." The SWAT commander approached Jake with visible confusion. "Captain Martinez?" "Sir, we received reports of a domestic terrorism cell, armed suspects, possible threat to community safety." Jake's response was calm, professional, and absolutely devastating. "Lieutenant Morrison, you're looking at the Rodriguez-Johnson family barbecue. Those armed suspects are off-duty law enforcement officers, active military, and federal agents. That domestic terrorism cell is my extended family celebrating my grandfather's memorial." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Brenda Hartwell's panicked breathing as she realized exactly how badly she'd just miscalculated. Lieutenant Morrison's face went through several shades of red as he processed what had just happened. "Captain," someone reported armed militants gathering for anti-government activities. "Lieutenant, who filed that report?" Morrison consulted his tablet. Anonymous tip called in by. He paused, checking the details. Mrs. Brenda Hartwell, 47,240 Desert Rose Road. Claimed to have observed suspicious individuals with weapons planning coordinated activities against local government. Jake's voice dropped to the tone that made hardened criminals break down and confess. Mrs. Hartwell, did you file a false report claiming my family was engaged in domestic terrorism? Brenda's face had gone from flushed to pale, her eyes darting between Jake's badge and the SWAT officers who were beginning to understand they'd been used as weapons in a neighborhood dispute. I saw all the official vehicles and people with guns, and it looked suspicious. Ma'am, Lieutenant Morrison interrupted, filing false reports of terrorism is a federal felony. Did you actually observe any illegal activities? Or did you call in this response because you didn't like the guest list at a permitted community barbecue? The truth was written all over Brenda's face. She'd seen a gathering of law enforcement family members and decided to weaponize the post-9/11 security apparatus against people whose only crime was not bowing to her authority. Jake pulled out his phone and began recording. Mrs. Hartwell, for the record, you called in a terrorism report on a permitted family barbecue attended by law enforcement officers, military personnel, and federal agents. Is that correct? I don't have to answer your questions. Actually, ma'am, you do. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his own recording device now active. You filed a report that initiated a multi-agency response involving SWAT deployment. We need to establish whether this was an honest mistake or deliberate misuse of emergency resources. What happened next was the most beautiful implosion I'd ever witnessed. Brenda Hartwell, accustomed to bullying individual property owners with bureaucratic weapons, found herself facing the full weight of the law enforcement community she'd tried to manipulate. I want to speak to your supervisor, she demanded. Jake smiled. Ma'am, I am the supervisor. Within hours, Brenda's false terrorism report had triggered a cascade of investigations that exposed the entire HOA corruption scheme. Jake's initial inquiry into her background revealed connections that painted a picture of systematic fraud involving county officials, development companies, and HOA board members. Detective Sarah Reyes, Jake's hand-picked investigator, arrived Monday morning with a warrant to examine HOA financial records and communication systems. What they found exceeded even Jake's suspicions. Marcus, your HOA president, has been running a sophisticated real estate manipulation scheme, Sarah explained, as we reviewed the evidence in Jake's office. They identify properties they want to acquire, then manufacture violations and compliance issues to force owners to sell below market value. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing payments from Hartwell Development Group to county inspectors. Email communications between Brenda and Inspector Davidson coordinating surprise inspections of targeted properties. Text messages between HOA board members discussing which families were problematic and needed to be encouraged to relocate. How many properties? I asked. 17 confirmed, possibly more. They've been systematically displacing longtime residents and flipping their land for luxury development. Your grandfather's ranch was just the latest target. Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Marcus, they weren't just harassing you for compliance. They were trying to steal your family's land through bureaucratic terrorism. What happens now? Now, Mrs. Hartwell and her co-conspirators get to explain their activities to a federal grand jury. Filing false terrorism reports, conspiracy to commit fraud, civil rights violations under color of law. We're talking serious federal prison time. But the investigation revealed something even more satisfying. The Hartwell Development Group's entire business model was based on acquiring properties below market value through manufactured compliance issues. With their scheme exposed, they faced lawsuits from every family they'd victimized, property seizure under federal forfeiture laws, and criminal prosecution for fraud. The best part, Sarah added with a smile, is that all their ill-gotten gains are subject to asset forfeiture. Every property they acquired through fraud goes back to the original owners or gets sold to compensate victims. Brenda Hartwell's empire of harassment was collapsing faster than a house of cards in a desert windstorm. The Desert Oaks Community Association called an emergency meeting 3 days after the SWAT incident. The community center was packed with residents who'd finally learned the truth about their HOA president's activities, and the mood was somewhere between outraged and mortified. I arrived to find Jake and Sarah waiting in the parking lot, both wearing their official uniforms and expressions that suggested they were there in a professional capacity. We thought the community should hear directly from law enforcement about Mrs. Hartwell's activities, Jake explained as we walked toward the building. Inside, Brenda sat at the head table, looking like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Her usual designer clothes had been replaced by a conservative business suit, and her trademark confidence had evaporated entirely. The other board members looked equally uncomfortable, clearly aware they were now associated with criminal activity. Board Vice President Tom Wheeler called the meeting to order with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address recent developments regarding the management of our community association. You mean criminal activities? Called out Mrs. Chen from the third row. Several other residents nodded agreement. Tom's face flushed. We're still investigating the allegations. There are no allegations, Jake said, standing up from his seat in the back. Mrs. Hartwell has been charged with filing false reports, conspiracy to commit fraud, and civil rights violations. The investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic corruption involving county officials and development companies. The room erupted in angry voices. Residents who'd received bogus citations began comparing stories. Families who'd been pressured to sell their properties realized they'd been victims of organized fraud. How long has this been going on? Demanded Mr. Patterson, whose elderly mother had been forced to sell her home after receiving thousands in fabricated fines. Sarah stood to address the community. Our investigation suggests at least 3 years of coordinated activity designed to force out longtime residents and enable below-market property acquisition by Hartwell Development Group. Are our property values affected? Someone called out. That depends, Sarah replied. Properties acquired through fraud will be returned to their original owners or sold at fair market value. However, the community association itself may face significant legal liability from victimized families. The implications were staggering. Desert Oaks had been built on stolen land, managed by criminals, and funded through systematic fraud. Every family who'd bought property believing they were joining a legitimate community had instead become unwitting participants in organized crime. Brenda Hartwell hadn't said a word during the entire meeting, but as residents began filing out, she approached me with the kind of desperation that suggested she finally understood the magnitude of her situation. Marcus, we can work something out. Drop the charges, and I'll make sure all your citations are dismissed. Jake stepped between us before I could respond. Ma'am, you're facing federal charges. This isn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. It's a criminal matter. But I was just trying to maintain community standards. By filing false terrorism reports? By conspiring to defraud property owners? By violating the civil rights of longtime residents? Jake's voice carried the cold authority of someone who'd spent his career dealing with people who justified their crimes through self-righteous delusions. Brenda Hartwell's war against my family had evolved into a federal case that would destroy everything she'd built on the foundation of other people's suffering. The trial lasted 3 weeks and made headlines across Southern California. HOA and REENOFTERRO are screamed the Los Angeles Times. DESERTDAVLEEELANTFRAUDEXPOSAD announced the San Diego Union Tribune. Sarah testified about the evidence they'd uncovered: bank records, communications, testimonies from county officials who'd accepted bribes to red tag properties on command. Jake provided expert testimony about the systematic nature of the conspiracy and the federal civil rights violations involved. But the most powerful testimony came from the victims. 17 families who'd been forced from their homes through manufactured violations. Elderly residents who'd been bankrupted by fraudulent fines. Working-class families who'd lost generational property to a scheme designed to benefit wealthy developers. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman whose home had been stolen through fake compliance issues, looked directly at Brenda during her testimony. "You destroyed my family's legacy for money. 40 years of memories, gone because you decided my property was worth more than my life." Brenda's defense attorney tried to argue that she was simply an overzealous HOA president who'd been manipulated by her husband's development company. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, the victims too numerous. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false reports, civil rights violations under color of law, and racketeering. Her husband, Robert, faced additional charges related to the development fraud and bribery of county officials. Judge Patricia Reeves' sentencing was swift and unforgiving. "Mrs. Hartwell, you weaponized legitimate government processes against innocent families for personal financial gain. You turned community association governance into organized crime. You filed false terrorism reports against law-abiding citizens whose only offense was not submitting to your authority." Brenda Hartwell was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Her husband got 12. Inspector Davidson received 5 years and forfeiture of his county pension. But the real justice came in the civil settlements. Every family victimized by the scheme received compensation from the seized Hartwell development assets. Properties stolen through fraud were returned to their original owners. The Desert Oaks Community Association was dissolved and replaced with a resident-controlled homeowners group focused on actual community service rather than harassment. Jake pulled up in his sheriff's department, SUV off-duty, and carrying a 6-pack of beer and the kind of satisfied smile that comes with a job well done. "How does it feel to be a free man?" he asked, settling into Grandpa Joe's old rocking chair. "Like justice," I replied.